You know, we got a great guest on the line. Let's, without any further ado, go straight to him. My old boss and friend, Preston Manning in Calgary. Preston, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you, Ezra.
Preston, I read an interview you did with the National Post the other day where you talked about the benefits of going slow, maybe slowing things down, the pace down a little bit. What do you mean by that? Because I always thought the Reform Party wanted to change things in a hurry.
Well, I was talking more about people in the immediate political arena, Ezra, who don't have time hardly to think about the issues they have to address, let alone develop answers. And the point I was making is you better to have done that thinking before you get into the political arena, because there's not a lot of time to do it when you're there. So more talking about preparation if you want to participate politically rather than always just making it up on the fly.
You know, that's good advice. And I know in the media business where you got daily deadlines and news breaking with Twitter, if you haven't done your thinking and don't know your philosophy when you're in, you probably won't find it. What do you think about just taking the long-term view? Here's what I mean. I look at a lot of the enemies of Canada who want to undermine our industry and our democracy and our freedom. And they, in many cases, have 20 or 50-year plans to deindustrialize or to attack our oil industry. And so they go in thinking, well, I might lose a battle, but I'll win the war. I'm not sure if conservatives have a 10 or 50-year plan for, what they want the country to look like in the year 2075 in terms of freedom. Do you do, super long-range thinking like that yourself?
Well, I don't think it's necessary so much to have a plan. Like I'm dubious about plans, particularly in the hands of social engineers. But I do think it's important to think through what your values are and how they might apply to the various situations that you would encounter in the political arena. For example, in the 60s, the late 60s, my father came to the conclusion that Quebec was going to make a secession attempt. So he said, you better study, if you're going to be interested in federal politics, you better study how do federal states handle secession attempts. Well, that was in, say, 65. By golly, by 1995, there was a real secession attempt. But if you started to try and figure all that out at the moment that you became conscious of that crisis in 1995, it's too late. To think about it early, when you've maybe got the time to think about it.
Can I ask you about another approach? And this is what Stephen Harper has been described as incrementalist conservatism. Instead of radical change overnight, slowly but surely changing 1 degree, then another degree. Take Aboriginal affairs. This I Don't Know More movement has been talking about spectacular utopian changes. But Harper has been going slowly but surely, doing band-by-band negotiations. Right now he's talking to the Premier of Northwest Territories to devolve power there. I think maybe you get more done if you take a slow and steady approach than go for the spectacular big win in one fell swoop. What do you think?
Oh yes, and when you've got 650 bands in Canada, this idea that you can come up with some universal solution to the challenges facing Aboriginal people is ludicrous. See, that's partly what's wrong with the old Indian Act, which is really based on that proposition. And I think certainly the better way is to go piece by piece. The other thing that, regardless of what the politician thinks about incrementalism, at least my experience with Canadians is if you want them to go from A to C, you have to show them B. You got to show them some intermediate point in the middle, which again suggests a step-by-step approach rather than trying to come up with some universal grand solution and jumping there all in one leap.
Preston, can I talk to you a little more about Indian affairs? I know you used to do consulting with different Indian bands before you got into politics. That was probably 20, 30 years ago now, but there's some lessons you learned with your hands-on work back then that could apply today. Do you have any thoughts in the wake of the I Don't Know More protests that are maybe more constructive?
Well, I think more along the lines that you already alluded to, Ezra, that seeking some universal solution to the challenges facing Aboriginal people, you're just not going to come up with it, and it's not going to fit any one band. But there are individual bands that have made progress, have sort of broken out of the old mode, have got into economic development, have tried to establish some sorts of property rights on reserves, have looked not just to government to do everything, but have looked more to the private sector, civil society, their own families and individuals. I think identifying the ones that have broken out and trying to encourage them as examples to other bands is a better approach than seeking some universal replacement for the Indian Act.
You know, one of the things that frustrates me when we look at other cultures is people say, oh, they're not built for freedom. They're not built for capitalism. I hear people say that about mainland China. They say, oh, their Confucian ethic is not for individual liberty. And I hate hearing that because I want to believe that every single human being, regardless of race or culture, loves freedom and loves to make individual choices. Do you think that sometimes white folks have the soft bigotry of low expectations and say, oh, they're Indian, that's not their way. Historically, they didn't have property rights, so we shouldn't push it on them. I mean, maybe that's true, but I don't want to believe it's true. I want to believe an Indian is just like you and me and can love liberty just as much.
No, I think that's true, Ezra. Anytime you give people a choice between, exercising their own freedom and control over their own lives and situations versus ceding it to someone else, particularly ceding it to a government, whether it's an Aboriginal government or the federal government or whatever, most ordinary folks will choose, I want to be as in control of my own life to the maximum extent that I can.
Preston Manning, it's great to talk to you again. I hope to talk to you again really soon.
Thanks, Ezra.